Who are they? The Lost Boys? They're the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. Oh, what fun it must be. Yes, but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship. Girls, you know, are much too clever to fall out of their prams.
Why don't we start with the fact that most people, whether they've seen any data on this or not, are aware that men are the majority of criminals and perpetrate the majority of violence. We have statistics on this, so we can put numbers to it, but I don't think that statement is in the least bit controversial. And what remains to be argued over is why that's the case.
Men are also the victims of the majority of violent crimes.
That's actually far less widely known, which is worth noting.
With only, I guess, rape and sexual assault being the exceptions.
Yeah, those are the two crimes where the victims are disproportionately female, but every other violent crime, including and up to murder, includes male victims, is majority male victim. So male perpetrator, male victim. I think maybe beginning with what we're supposed to think is the reason for this. And I think we're heavily tilted now towards socialization, that men are cut off from their emotions and exhibit toxic behaviors that lead to or make violence inevitable. And there's some, I think, very grave flaws with that thesis that are worth discussing.
Well, I mean, I think maybe it's interesting then to go, to take it way far back. Mm-hmm. Hunter-gatherer culture.
Mm-hmm. You can go farther back, actually.
You can go to primates, right, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
Early man. But when I was reading this morning, I was sort of blown away by a few statistics. But one thing that really piqued my curiosity was the role testosterone plays, which I guess is obvious if we're, reducing this to a biological conversation about the differences between men and women and why men might have a more violent proclivity. But I think it's interesting to note that it's a problem across all systems. It knows no gender, no race, no class, no country. Violence among men are violent in every culture throughout history since we were primates.
Yeah, be careful. There is the class thing. There's large differences in class in terms of violence. Murder isn't nearly as common in high-income neighborhoods as it is in low-income neighborhoods. Robert Sapolsky, who I think I quoted in our notes there, and he was one of the foremost primatologists, a Stanford professor of human behavioral biology, and he wrote a recent book called Behave, which is the neuroscience of human behavior. He said something like testosterone is really it increases your investment in status games, and some of those status games involve violence, and so you're going to be more likely to participate in those. The actual physiology of violence is it's more complicated than any one hormone, but it's also so obviously the case anatomically that men are, let's say, better at violence.
They're stronger. They're physically stronger.
Do you want to read some of this? Because again, to say men are stronger, that's not a controversial statement to most people.
But to talk about anatomy, you're saying it actually gets more nuanced.
Oh, I was going to say how much stronger and more powerful.
In a widely quoted study on punching power, men averaged 162% greater force in their punch than women.
Yeah.
And the weakest male still punched harder than the strongest female.
Yeah.
And then there's the grip strength. 90% of females produce less grip force than 95% of males.
I think the average person, male or female, is broadly aware of this. I'm blown away how many of my liberal friends are unaware of this.
Really?
It's kind of shocking, actually.
That they wouldn't agree objectively that men across the board,
or they wouldn't concede how great the difference is.
Really?
Shocking.
I mean, when you do look at puny men and think I definitely am biased.
But that's
I think I could take out a lot of men.
That's so, yeah. So there was a tweet went viral. This was like a month ago about some girl saying how like her boyfriend's skinnier than her. She's like, I could wrestle you. Like I could beat you in wrestling. I'm thicker than you are. And she tried and just got pinned down instantly. And she said like the tweet was like a kind of tweet thread. It's, like, girls, you should try this. Like guys are shockingly strong.
But they're not shockingly strong.
And I've seen like YouTube videos of people going around Manhattan and like literally asking mostly young women, like, like, do you think men are better at sports? Do you think men are stronger? Like, maybe a little. Like part of why I want to quantify that difference in strength is because if we aren't shockingly made aware of that on a regular basis, it's because men don't use their strength and aggression against women nearly as much as they hypothetically could.
Or that we're perhaps meant to believe is the case.
Right.
Right. Which is another topic for another time. But
it's also, we have a society like with the rule of law and with a supposedly neutral police force that enforces the rule of law. But for a lot of human history and for a lot of places on the planet now, might is right. And in any society where might is right, men have a massive, massive advantage. And when societies break down and collapse, as they do throughout history, you see that unleashed, and it's a terrifying, terrifying thing.
Obviously, women have less testosterone than men. Testosterone gives way to male behaviors in the realm of competitiveness, aggression. It gives rise to certain male behaviors that make going to war perhaps more possible for them.
It also inhibits empathy.
And so that's huge.
There's
I'm just trying to point out that it's something that's coursing through the veins of one sex much more so than another.
Yes. Yeah.
And that surely does play a role.
It does. So we've pointed out grip strength and punching strength are different in men and women. There are evolutionary biologists who will tell you that like facial anatomy is also like men are built to take punches in a way that women are not built to take punches. Grip strength and punching strength, like your arm is a club, and at the end of that, if you make a fist, it's like a weapon. It's a rock. Like we're punching mammals. That's primarily how we inflict damage, and men are much better at that than women. And then at the level of the mind, it's also really worth noting because in its milder form, this precipitates a lot of the tension between men and women. Women are more empathic. And the difference between empathy in the average woman versus the average man is not great. So the studies I'm aware of, what they did is they presented men and women with a series of pictures of faces and asked them to intuit based on just the picture of the face what emotion was going through that person's mind. And then they scored that 0 to 5, where 0 is you have no idea, and that's like you're probably autistic, like or you're so far on that spectrum that looking at someone's face means nothing to you because you can intuit nothing from it. So like, the people who are very autistic might have a conversation with you and they'll never look you in the eyes because they're not reading your emotions well. And then people who scored a 5 on the other end were so empathic that like if they saw someone else in pain, it ruined their day. Like they couldn't focus on what they needed to do because someone else's pain was so disturbing to them. And I believe the average woman scored a 4 and the average man scored a 3. So not a massive difference. But then if you looked at the extremes, which gender scored the most 5s and which gender scored the most 0s, all of a sudden the differences are massive. All of a sudden there are way more extremely empathic women and way more unempathic men. And a good explanation for why that is empathy is wonderful if you have to raise children or if your health depends on your position in society. Like if you don't want to get cast out of society, you need to be able to fit in and please people, or God, that sounds. But it's also inhibiting if what you need to do is kill someone who's attacking you, or maybe hunt. or hunt or even take someone's resources or
defend your family.
And I'm talking about our pre-human history too, because our brains were formed before human beings. Like structures of our brains predate humans splitting off from apes. So that's how deep these things go.
And there are other studies that have been done on personality and behavioral differences between men and women that also reveal that men are more verbally aggressive.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yes.
Which also explains why I think men are more likely to engage in unprovoked aggression or respond to
that was one of the findings
provocation.
as well. Right. More sensitive to that. and more likely to engage in unprovoked provocation, unprovoked aggression. And then women, I think you have it in front of you, but more likely to be indirect in their aggression, which is so fascinating.
More subtle, more conniving.
Right, but it's so funny because that's actually, you can punch someone in the face and do a lot of damage, but ruining someone's reputation can do a lot of damage too. Gossip can do a lot of damage. I mean, no, really, like that's an effective way to destroy someone if you're good at it. If you're good at sowing those seeds of doubt and distrust in the community.
The Lady Macbeths.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to, I'm curious, we were saying, like, so regarding testosterone and the need to maintain status. By that, we mean like a pecking order.
Mm-hmm.
So if crime, I'm thinking of The Sopranos and The Wire, if crime is a means to success or wealth, then it's an obvious choice for men.
Yeah, especially if there aren't better or more obvious alternatives.
Right, obviously, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're aware, the people who do this, they're aware that a lot of the other good things in life, namely access to women, goes up as their status goes up. So that's a big incentive for them to play this game, to commit to a life of crime and to be good at it. But I want to address, like, I still think we have to talk about why it's inaccurate or incomplete to say that the reason men are more violent or more criminal has to do with socialization. Because I do think that, like, how you raise men, how you socialize them plays a very important role. But it's not an accident that in the absence of socialization, for example, from broken homes, more men than women end up committing crime or perpetrating acts of violence. This is like we're scratching at toxic masculinity, like that phrase, and that entire concept.
But you're saying socialization is not enough to explain.
Yes, and I'm also saying an awareness. So a lot of what they'll say is, well, we raise men to be competitive, or we raise them to like, there's a lot of emphasis placed on like how important sports are to young boys, and there are people who think that that's a bad thing. That we're giving them an excuse to be aggressive or to be competitive or status oriented, and it's exactly the opposite. It's we're giving those impulses in them an outlet that doesn't tear down society or burn down the home. Or that's the beauty of all of those things, actually, for men.
It channels that energy, that testosterone, in the healthiest ways possible.
Right. And I remember
But just because some people don't value the outlet, I think that's where the root of the argument lies in.
They're saying
a devaluation of what sports even means to society and culture, right?
Or I think they're even making a stronger case, which is that there's a causal link between like boys playing football and then boys being aggressive.
Boys playing the swords.
Right.
Right. If we scratch a little deeper into the notion of toxic masculinity, we don't have to look very far at all to find examples of that. But
examples of men being toxic, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, yeah.
Well, no, of course.
Toxic
that's visible to everyone.
That's visible. Yeah.
Yeah.
And really, truly, I mean, I'm sure people can, some people probably experience that daily, depending on the kind of father you have or the kind of relationships
you
engage in.
There are countries in the world where the person with the most power is a toxic male.
Is a tyrant.
Is a tyrant.
Is a dictator.
It's a pretty good definition of toxic masculinity, as someone who...
Are we bold enough to name names?
Well, then, sure. It's a long list.
But that being said, I think sometimes I struggle with this idea that men are either or at any given time. This notion that it doesn't take much for something like let's say they didn't like take away the outlet of sports or healthier outlets for aggression and high testosterone behavior. It's as though it doesn't take much to push men over the edge into something more violent.
No, I think there's probably a lot of truth to that.
Okay, so I don't know if I agree.
People do like crimes of passion, for example, where someone with no criminal history whatsoever walks home one day and finds his wife in bed with another man.
And boom, they're both dead.
And murders them.
Right. There's an entire TV series devoted to that. That's
a pretty good example of a snapping moment where everything was restrained and then all of a sudden...
And
I think a lot of road rage incidents work the same way.
Oh, that's a good example. But so would you say as a man then, for you, are you ever in touch with like that thin veil? Are you like,
oh yes,
push back the curtain and I'll unleash on you?
I mean, you learn to restrain it, but the impulses are always there. Absolutely always. This is something I hate to keep invoking Jordan Peterson, but he got in trouble at one point.
No, we don't.
I mean, it upsets people. But he got in trouble at one point because he was describing what happens in a debate between two men when the debate becomes unreasonable. When someone kind of stops basing the debate on reason and starts to become personal or irrational. Like, he said this, that's going to end in a fist fight, and it will. I see that all the time. I see men. I've been.
Oh, I mean, I've observed it my whole life being your younger sibling and watching your friends.
No, but I'm talking about, I've seen adult men.
Oh, yeah, of course. I've seen
like
it too.
playing amateur sports.
Pick up
and
basketball on a Wednesday
They disagree
night.
on a foul call or a line call or whatever it is. And, 2 seconds after disagreeing, they're in each other's faces. And a second after that, they're punching each other. That happens regularly.
But what's interesting, and then I don't know, I certainly don't think this is true across the board, but as quickly as it escalates, it also de-escalates. It's almost like the second you've launched the punch and it's landed, it's satisfying, and both people can walk away feeling like they're vindicated.
Sometimes it doesn't de-escalate and you have a murder, but probably more often than not, it de-escalates.
I'd like to think that more often than not.
No, certainly more often than not.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of the punching. I've never witnessed a murder. I think men also have an allowance for that in other men. Like, they know that there's a point where an average man might snap. They'll be upset at the man who snaps too quickly, and they'll ostracize that guy. But at the same time, they make a big allowance for, like, okay, like at this point, yeah, like of course he's going to be upset. Like,
and
you pushed and pushed.
But there are also scenarios in which maybe the provoker understands what he was doing. When he gets punched, he almost respects the other person more for having done so. It's like a sous-entendu subtext of like,
well, you can't let people walk all over you either.
Right. Pecking order, but also respect, self-respect.
Or
self-worth.
One of the better books on crime I've read in the past 5 years was this book called Ghetto Side by Jill Levy, who was a Los Angeles Times reporter. And in one section of the book, she's breaking down what are the causes of murder in Los Angeles, like what precipitated it. And one big cause, I think she actually names this as the biggest cause, is fights over women. But another one is perceived insults to reputation. So if you go around saying someone's, not as tough as they say they are, you're harming their reputation, and your reputation's pretty important. And that's something that even at the micro level of amateur sports, people, I've witnessed men be very insecure about their reputations. What'd you say about me? What'd you say about me?
And even if you're outside of that realm and you've watched good TV in the last 15 years, 20 years, The Sopranos and The Wire paint that beautifully.
Well, so it's funny that you say that, because those are both crime shows. And if you're in the criminal underworld, a big deterrent to someone coming to kill you and take your position in the hierarchy is your reputation. So if you're known as someone who, like, you can be shot at and you don't retaliate, that's really bad. It shows vulnerability. So you go you go over the top hard at anyone who dares to kind of confront you. And that's very much Tony Soprano. It's very much The Wire. That's quite literally how, like, they guard their reputations very closely, because they understand that that's a big deterrent to other people kind of coming after them and taking them down. They have something precious. They can't go to the police. There's no third party neutral arbiter here, right? They can't make an appeal to the law and say, look, this person wronged me. They stole from me. Arrest them. Well, they stole your illegal drugs. So, you can't go to the police. So what do? You go back really hard at them. The cartels are like this in Mexico. It's one of the reasons the violence is so terrible, because there's warring cartels. And if one cartel gets attacked, the retaliation is 10 times whatever the attack was. You're constantly escalating to show you mean business, and any attack on me, I'll return on you tenfold. And
you're also constantly surrounded by mostly men.
Well, the criminal world. That's so amusing they say that. Like, there's not a single, I can't think of a domain in human life that is more dominated by men.
But also in that sense, there
Crime.
Is nothing really around you. Whatever life circumstances gave rise to your chosen career as a criminal mob boss, there is no one around you really besides perhaps maybe your wife or child to de-escalate any given scenario. Which is really interesting, because there are many moments in The Sopranos and many, many scenes where Tony often has to physically calm down his comrades.
Right. Well, it's crime is one of those areas where unbridled male aggression could be advantageous.
Is advantageous.
Right. It's not like in an office setting, you could have people like you're gunning for promotion and someone else is doing it. That someone else, a competitor of yours wants that same promotion. And maybe they're even doing things behind your back to undermine your chance. But you can't all of a sudden, like puff up your chest and scream at them in the middle of the office. Like that will get you a reputation that will harm your chances of getting that promotion. You have to control your aggression.
But there is a puffing up of chest in other ways.
Absolutely. It's nonviolent.
But that can't be disregarded either. I think there is that male display of competitiveness in the workforce is.
But that's why we're never going to eradicate football or hockey. These are or UFC. These are boxing. These are ultra violent sports. And they're hugely popular. And part of that is it's sublimated violence. Football really is war. It's the closest thing in sport to war. And the coaches are opposing generals. And that's so much of what is attractive to it at a very basic level for men. It's seeing two teams go to war against each other.
And there's also, it's interesting, there's also so much positive reinforcement for what I would call positive masculinity. Trust, teamwork, loyalty, respect.
Building towards a goal greater than yourself.
Greater than yourself.
Yeah. And submitting voluntarily to a hierarchy, which is also really important.
So, but to get back to my question, because I'm still curious about it, you would say that snap between acting on your aggression and feeling aggressive.
Oh, you can have the most violent impulses and not act on them. I mean, if
as a male,
you've been well raised,
that regularly.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because I've definitely felt moments where I feel
rage.
Physically rage, and I want to physically act on it.
Yeah. Oh, well, because these are still human. I mean, I'm not suggesting men have a monopoly on this.
No, of course they're still human. But I think what's interesting to sort of explore maybe a little bit, I funnily enough, I can only think of 2 moments in my life where I became physically violent with someone, and it was in the context of sports.
Mm-hmm.
In middle school, playing inner city basketball.
Mm-hmm.
And something about that context made me feel less culpable. Like I in one instance, I definitely was the first to act, first to strike. And on the second instance, I got away with a very dirty foul because the girl was playing very aggressively and the ref was never calling her fouls. So I did something that was very unkind underneath the net that went unnoticed by everybody. And I felt no guilt or remorse whatsoever about it. And I really hurt her. She had to be pulled out of the game and no one understood what happened.
Uh-huh.
But because it was in the context of sports and because it was a war and because it was a championship game and because she was acting like a bitch, I made sure to let her know.
Well,
in those moments, that's the closest I felt to what it might be like to have testosterone levels like coursing through me at higher levels.
Uh-huh.
And I've had moments like that. And even at that, like sometimes I think I'm channeling male energy to a point where I think it's delusional. Like I played rugby.
I know, I remember.
And every time I thought like, oh yeah, like there's like, this, like I can do what a dude can do. And then I'd pivot to a co-ed game and it's a whole different game.
Uh-huh.
And then it's a whole different kind of fear.
Mm-hmm. Well, probably the women who play rugby, it's probably like, because there are not as many women who participate in these aggressive, violent sports. So probably they're already, more of the sample of all women, they lean towards the more competitive, more aggressive variety. Like I remember you as a teenager, you were very competitive and very aggressive. You could be.
Nothing's changed.
Yeah.
When there's an arena and UFC is, like you said, it's amazing. Like it's the most violent thing I can possibly think of watching. On television, that's available to us on television, really. Would you say that? Like it's, I don't
UFC?
think it's the most violent display of, aggression.
Any combat sport,
but like boxing even somehow doesn't feel as
well. The purpose of boxing and UFC is to either submit or knock out the other person. Like those are pretty. You're damaging the other person physically to win.
The difference is in UFC, no pads, no nothing. raw rumbling and someone can actually break their neck within the first 2 minutes. It's highly possible.
I mean, yeah, I think, yeah.
But it's mind blowing that like
boxing does a lot of damage too.
No, of course,
any combat sport.
It's kind of mind blowing to bear witness to that as like something that we're allowing to take place. Like sometimes I have this moment of like, how is this even legal? Like, what are we crazy? Like, this is barbaric. Like, I thought we were way past this.
It might even be though that I mentioned earlier that of the people who have zero empathy, the majority are male. That will equally be true of the people who are the most aggressive. That subset of the population will be majority male. And if you don't have these supervised, regulated outlets for their violence and aggression, like what do you expect them to do? Like maybe it's actually a good thing that like people who are like capable, like one of the things that when I started playing football that I loved football, but I had a hard time tackling people. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I really didn't.
I remember watching you hesitate.
I had to learn how to do that. And like something I struggled with even, for the 3 or 4 years I played football. But then there were guys who wanted to hurt people. And that was part of the attraction. Like that was like, and
because it was okay.
My teammates were like that. Well, no, they, outside of they were probably the school bully too.
No, but football gave them a place where that was okay.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so I'm suggesting to you that one of the reasons you might not want to, deregulate or disallow combat sports is that's an outlet for people who maybe need an outlet. Their personalities don't do so well in other settings. And those are some strange dudes who do UFC, Chris. I don't know. Like,
oh no, they're very
that's a rare breed of, they're hyper competitive. It's actually a perfect example of everything we've been talking about, because a big part of the lead up to a fight in UFC is the media press events where you put them in the same room and they mean mug each other down. And they talk shit to each other. That's all. I mean, all of that is.
And they say some terrifying things.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah.
Most people wouldn't dare to enter into the ring with someone who says those things to you.
Oh man, I'm blanking on whatever. Like Mike Tyson, there's beautiful little compilation videos of all the trash talk Mike Tyson used to give. Anyway, like
I'm gonna fuck you till you love me.
Till you love me. There's there's a good one. Yeah. Yeah.
Mike Tyson maybe being the ultimate trash talker. But I mean,
there are a lot of good ones. But that's all. I'm drawing a parallel between the criminal whose reputation is so important to him because if he loses that rep, all of a sudden he's vulnerable in the streets, to these fighters who are equally concerned about their reputations and their status in the pecking order. It's so visible.
So, and also, I mean, that begs the question, I guess I'm wondering then about how naive society has become, or maybe a more female-oriented, or the naivete of removing things like from as minor, seemingly at a young age of recess, to taking away football and the consequences of that.
Or what it really does mean to compete against men, because you're competing against people who are that hyper competitive.
But also, I guess, like then just getting back to the denial of our biological differences. It's kind of ridiculous in a way to not consider the role something like testosterone plays, or aggression or competitiveness for men versus women. I think it's so interesting to think that there are people, well, I mean, interesting, I think it's scary because it can alter policy and does so much damage ultimately, but like women have absolutely zero idea what it's like to have high levels of testosterone. There's no way to directly experience that unless you're injecting it into you. And like, so most of the time when I saw fights break out as a kid or like as a teen or even now, like after like on petty pickup basketball games, I'm always like a little bit in shock because I'm like the level, the degree to which these men are completely reacting and the lack of forethought and like there's just like this like senseless act of aggression.
And from the outside, the stakes are so low.
They're so low, and it looks stupid. It feels ridiculous, and it's so easy to judge.
But it's fair. All of
those,
and
all of those things are fair.
Yeah.
It is ridiculous. It is stupid.
There is nothing really at stake.
There's nothing absolutely at stake.
And
yet,
why are you getting so worked up over a pickup game at the local park?
And yet it's those very traits in their most primitive state on display before me that I also recognize are what allow men to enter into backbreaking work, to go off to war, to defend. They go hand in hand.
Yeah. I think an example I've given you before, but just to bring this home for people, if you look at, like, if you go to any commercial gym in America, there'll be fitness classes, which is like, you know, there's an instructor and people are dancing to the music, or they're just copying the moves of the instructor.
Filled with women.
Like yoga is like it's like
Zumba. Is that still a thing?
I think so. All of those kind of class group oriented fitness instructional activities are popular among women. And then if you look at recreational sports, which will be housed in the same gym, like if you're going to like a 24-hour fitness or a YMCA, all of a sudden the gender ratio flips. And whether it's like volleyball or ball hockey or basketball, all of a sudden it's more men. And all of a sudden that's where you see like people yelling at each other, complaining about calls at these very low stakes games. And another example that I think is so telling as well, running in general as a fitness activity is apparently more popular with women in America than men. Like there are more women who regularly run than men. But when any city hosts a race or a marathon or whatever the case may be, more men sign up.
Competition.
Yeah. Oh, there's a chance to distinguish myself. There's medals. There's a podium. I'll be recognized for my achievement. I'll be ranked. You can tell me where I finished, how I stack up against the competition. And we're going to do a whole episode on video games, but what do you think video games tap into so perfectly?
All of those things.
Oh my God.
Also another outlet for violence.
Exactly. And that's actually a major theory about why violence began to decline in the late 80s, early 90s. It was all of a sudden
the rise of video games.
Right. Yeah. There's another outlet for your competitive nature.
You can carry it out in your fantasies. You don't even have to play sports.
Yeah. I grew up in the 90s, and one of the cultural battles of the 90s happened post-Columbine, and it was the Christian right attacking video games. They described video games as murder simulators. Video games like Doom and Grand Theft Auto. And I remember the kind of stand made by the video game industry against what it viewed as a kind of Puritanism and a kind of ridiculous assertion that playing these games was training kids to murder, because those games are so popular and the murder rate was going down. It didn't square with reality. And then fast forward to like the 2010s, early 2010s, and now it's the progressive left making the exact same arguments that these games are teaching men not to be empathetic. They're murder simulators. They went after Grand Theft Auto again because that series has been ongoing for a couple decades now.
Because it's so popular. And I almost want to concede, like, I almost want to say, like, yeah, Call of Duty is a murder simulator. It really, or it's so graphic and realistic a war simulator that it gives you that experience. But it's not that it's teaching men not to be empathetic, let alone teaching them to kill. It's giving an outlet for all of those impulses in them that has zero consequences. So they can be as aggressive as they like, but they don't actually like hurt anyone. And in that respect, it's actually a great thing. The impulses are there. That's why men are attracted to these games to begin with. I mean, my God, like, I don't know if since Corona hit, like Call of Duty Warzone, it's like the biggest thing on the internet. It's what's captivating. If you're a man between 18 and 35, like that's what you're doing with your time in the West. You're playing Call of Duty Warzone. At least a large chunk of them, more than any other single online activity other than maybe porn. And yeah, it's very violent. Which is interesting because, like, so while the propensity for violence in men has maybe not gone down on the level of impulses, we are currently living in our least violent era in human history.
Yeah.
For the most part.
In the West, especially. Yeah.
Steven Pinker addresses that in The Better Angels of Our Nature.
Yeah.
But I think that's interesting too, because I mean, you just gave that somewhat depressing statistic that like most men are at home right now playing.
I don't find it that depressing.
I mean, right. We'll get into that. In the next episode. But I think what's interesting is they're not actually being called to. They're not actually being called to do anything, let alone go to war. they have no lived experience with what it actually means
of course
take
not.
on to respond to the call of duty, ironically.
No, of course not.
And I think there's also something interesting to be said for that, because I'm slowly learning, and have learned through you, that one of the reasons young men really get into video games is because there's a community available to them, and a fantasy-like version of what it means to be part of a troop and have camaraderie.
Yeah, but also highly competitive. There's
right, but all of the aspects of
you're rewarded for your accomplishments. Yeah,
which I think very few people, and maybe parents of these young men especially, really have no grasp on. No. If you're objectively looking at your son, shooting random people all day long on the screen.
Oh yeah, they're horrified.
They're horrified, yeah. But the underpinnings, I think, are actually rooted in at least some good.
I'm only suggesting that the attraction to these games, which is so great, is there because of something innate in men.
Right.
And that works also for
which
for
they
sports.
Clearly want to play out no matter what. Like they want to act on it in one way or another.
Yeah. Well, sorry, go back to like how boys play versus how girls play. Like so much of our organized play, when it wasn't a sport, which is already a kind of war, it's like team competition for a goal that, and with a zero-sum goal, like my team wins, your team loses, your team wins, my team loses. We had like snowball fights, and it was like, 20 on 20 snowball fights. It's the same concept. Like there's like so much of what little boys do is like, it's practice for war. It's practice for like tribal raids.
Well, certainly learning how
for
to
combat.
Also take a hit.
Well, so the games that were most popular also involved like throwing balls at people, like hitting people with balls.
We talked about
which
this,
is like the spear. Like it's all there. And people know, like, again, the average person who hasn't got a 4-year degree in the liberal arts in the last 20 years, they know this. Like they all know this isn't like they're actually going to think that it's a waste of our time to say these things because it's so obvious. But we're addressing people who did go through those 4 years of liberal arts and have had all of this hidden from them, even though they've seen a lot of the same things we've seen.
And also generations of feminists who are consistently denying these male realities or the male experience across the board.
Or pathologizing them.
Or pathologizing it from their perspective to suit their narrative.
Sure. And
I did think it was interesting, the study you brought up early on when we were talking about childhood and boyhood, is that opposite sex siblings are actually more able to name the differences between girls and boys than same-sex siblings.
And evolutionary biologists, I love this one. They've done studies on who in the general population is most able to intuit which characteristics are inherited. Because one of the things evolutionary biologists do is they'll assign how much of any given personality trait is a result of nature versus nurture. I won't get into how they do that, but you can rank order things like extroversion versus introversion. Is that genetic or is that cultural? Or is that how the child is raised? And the people who scored the best were mothers. Mothers were best able to say, no, he was like that before, like that was part of his innate character. That was part of her innate character. Mm. So I think that's nurture. No, sorry, that's nature, not nurture. I'm not surprised by that at all. Actually, one of the reasons why, here, I'll stake out a claim. One of the reasons why this gender as a social construct could have taken off as it did in the last 2 decades is because we have so many single child households.
Who have no experience.
So you don't get the experience as a parent of raising 2 kids. And you don't get
and observing the differences.
Or the experience as a child of growing up with a sibling of the opposite gender. No wonder it takes off now. Of course it does. Because we're deprived of what used to be like a natural part of existence, which was interacting from a young age with children of different genders.
That's interesting. And also, I don't think anyone wants to hear that either. Okay, so getting back to a scenario, I'm curious, just on a personal level, because I asked you before, like, if there were ever moments where having a sister sort of impacted you or your perception of yourself as a boy or as a young man, when you are on the football field and you have a hard time tackling. Mm-hmm. I would say, having known you since I was born, that's much more related to your nature. And I don't think you're a male who's quick to attack or quick on aggression.
I think that's probably true, but I can still say for myself, I absolutely have all those impulses. It's not like I go around.
Oh, no, I know you do. I've also seen you do the dead opposite, and you've stunned me, which I kind of love. The element of surprise. I'm still getting to know you. But I would also say, and I don't know if this is true, but like, however, in like at home, I think I could feel it almost viscerally as a kid. Like there were moments where you definitely wanted to go all out with me. And because I was your younger, more fragile, delicate sister, but tougher in other ways, you couldn't. Like I have physical like memories of like us like going toe to toe, and like I want to go as hard as I can, and I know you're restraining yourself. And I wonder, I mean, in on the level of nurture, I wonder how much having an opposite sibling, especially a younger sister for a boy, might alter or train their behavior not to be as reactive physically.
I think I don't.
Because we don't have any cousins also who have, interesting. We're the only.
Oh, it's true.
We have like 10 cousins, and we are the only opposite sex siblings.
Yeah. I will only say now what you've just jogged from my memory. I remember you cried a lot. And sometimes
hurtful?
No, it's just true. You cried a lot as a child, and sometimes I wanted to make you cry, and then you cried, and that was like gratifying. Sometimes I didn't want to make you cry, and you cried, and my reaction was guilt, like, oh, I didn't mean to hurt her feelings, like I did something wrong here.
How young are we when this is happening?
Young, like I don't even. And then I think the times that drove me craziest were like sometimes like I'd make you cry and I didn't mean to, and I couldn't figure out why you were crying, and that was like
you didn't understand how you hurt me.
Yeah, and that was like,
was it physical or verbal?
Probably verbal. It was probably always verbal. You were very. I'm not saying you weren't tough. You were very physically tough.
By necessity.
Probably.
No, definitely.
But yeah, I remember. And so you just asked me about socialization. Like I didn't want to make you cry. Like sometimes I was in a bad mood or I was angry at you, and I'm sure I did things where I was gratified when you cried at the end, as a child might do. But in general, I didn't want to make you cry, and I didn't want to hurt you. And like being aware that talking to you and joking, this is still something that I think is massively at play in society. Like the way men joke with each other is not the way they joke with women.
No, it's brutal.
It's really brutal how men joke with each other, and they take it.
It's enviable almost.
I mean, I think like there are lines. You can still cross lines.
Absolutely. But there's something honest, and also the level of forgiveness is also as high as the, worst comment.
Right.
Like it's easily forgiven and forgotten. Whereas women.
But it's all done in a spirit of like, that's part of the understanding is like, there's an underlying spirit of camaraderie that I can say these things that like are hurtful, but that I love you.
Also, I think men are also less emotionally involved in this statement. I don't think they take it on to such a personal degree that a woman might, that an average woman might.
And men who do take it personally when it wasn't intended to be personal, those men get ostracized from the company of other men. Like one of the things that'll earn you acceptance to a stranger group of men is being able to distinguish between something that was meant like in a lighthearted, joking way versus something that was really cutting. And if you mistake something that was meant as lighthearted and joking as something that was meant as cutting, those men aren't going to want to spend much time with you. Like I see that like
because you can't take it.
Yeah, like being able to take a joke is important.
Yeah,
like being and at your expense. That's one of the ways male camaraderie works.
And maybe male humility.
Maybe, yeah, male humor, male humility.
But it's interesting. I mean, like just to take it back to like us and our dynamic as kids, childhood memories, like seeing you cry for me as a kid was devastating.
Why?
Like it affected me deeply. It ruined my day.
Because I cried so rarely.
You cried rarely, but I wouldn't say as a kid you cried often enough. Like you were a sensitive kid, as I was. You were a sensitive child. No, but I mean that in a good way. I think and I also think it's a way that I see. I don't know. I was trying to get at that. I think in an earlier episode about how seeing a young boy cry, there's something that pierces through you a little bit. I don't know what that is for me, but it definitely has to do with you. And I think what's interesting to note is I have a very distinct memory. A lot of the times when you would annoy me, it's because you were doing something really stupid that I couldn't wrap my head around why you were doing it. And like, it was typical like young boy behavior of just like being really, really overly physical, and physical with me or physical with with a piece of furniture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just need to get out, really exert some energy.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this early memory where I'm watching TV on my stomach and I have my head on my hands, and you're deciding to cartwheel over me. And you keep cartwheeling over me and you're distracting me. And I keep saying, stop. And I'm being really calm because I'm watching my favorite show. I think it was Care Bears. And eventually I move a little bit just to get out of your way.
Mm-hmm.
And that causes you to take a bigger leap. And as you're taking a bigger leap, I don't know if you remember this, you got too close to the table and you cut your head on the table.
Mm-hmm.
You immediately broke down. You ran to mom. You're gushing blood from your head. And I remember like running to the kitchen because I was like kind of like excited by the drama.
Uh-huh.
And like mom was mad at me because like you had made it seem as though like this is something that I had caused. And at that point we're so close in age. And I don't remember having caused it, though I'm not saying it's impossible that I didn't. And I remember being so satisfied that you cut your head because all I was trying to do was point out how stupid you were being. But so much of my experience of watching men, and when I was babysitting 3 boys for as long, like for my high school, like I remember like that level of like, oh, like this is actually how they gain some kind of like relevant experience. This is actually how they gain some kind of like, oh, I got hurt doing this. This was stupid. I'm not going to do this again.
Mm.
And
testing limits.
Yeah, testing limits. And I think it's interesting because that like, as you were doing, like, it would never occur to me to do something as stupid as you were doing. It's something I would do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, boys are so, the way they play, like, it's
reckless.
It's very reckless, and it's often dangerous or borderline dangerous.
And I'm thinking back to what Kenny said in the interview we did with him recently about, you know, how older women would get mad at him when his son was jumping off picnic tables at 3 years old because they thought it was too dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And he was letting his son do it because his son told him that he could.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, he understood that there was a teaching moment here. And I feel like while there are similar moments for girls, I feel like the trial and error of growing up as a young man is really does involve like physically negotiating with the world in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And engaging with your physical environment.
I'm now remembering all of the things I jumped off of or tried to jump over. Like it was like a regular thing.
Broke because like...
Yeah. But interacting physically with the world and then testing your limits. We had high ceilings in our house. And I remember like from like being 12 to 14, I couldn't touch it was like a 11-foot ceiling or 10.5-foot ceiling.
You drove me nuts with that.
And I would like take 3 steps and try to touch the ceiling, take 3 steps, try to touch the, and as I grew taller and stronger, like eventually I got closer and eventually I was able to do it. Yeah, they're probably still handprints from my 14-year-old self on the ceilings of that house. Or
the hours and hours, like whenever conveniently I needed to go practice piano, you insisted on playing hockey right next to me. Anyway, but like so all of this like
unresolved sibling tension.
No, but I think what I'm trying to I think this is like all of these things we're talking about in relation to the origins of male violence. I think it's important to talk about the consequences of not acknowledging differences.
Well, the biggest consequence is you might stop socializing men in a way that channels those innate aggressions and innate competitiveness into something productive.
And we're already trying to do that.
Right.
But well, as a small example, removing recess.
Removing fathers. Because fathers innately know.
What do you mean by removing fathers?
Well, if you have fewer fathers in the home, you have fewer...
But who's removing them?
Oh, our society has done that. It's shocking the degree to which children in America today are growing up without a father's involvement or a regular father's involvement. And for sons, it's devastating because they do have, like, you're not going to be able to eradicate those impulses from a child, from a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy. And if you don't have the masculine authority figure there, who's also gone through that experience and can help you channel those energies somewhere, or at least teach you how to control them. And part of teaching you how to control them is punishing you when you go too far, punishing you when you do something that's destructive. Well, all of a sudden, those impulses start to control you and run wild. And you can see that. I mean, like, that's what crime in America is. It's largely a function of like untrammeled masculinity, unrestrained masculinity.
That has become toxic. that in and of itself is not necessarily toxic.
Right.
I think that's an important distinction that we're not really looking for that nuance anymore.
Yeah.
Like historically, for example, like I think it's important to hammer that point home a little bit, is obviously there has, I mean, since the beginning of civilization, there's always been crime. And crime can also be the result of like this stem from mental illness and other factors, and desperation and dire circumstances. But if we're talking about unbridled masculinity as a potential factor in high crime rates, I think it's also interesting to note that it's also what historically has protected women and children and societies. Right.
So that I mentioned before,
like the double-edged sword.
Yes, men's lack of empathy,
of manhood.
Men's lack of empathy, which is that's a terrible way to phrase
reductive.
It. Well, to say that men in general have less empathy than women, that's a negative thing in the context, often for women in the context of heterosexual relationships with men, because how did you not know that saying that was going to hurt me, or forgetting this was going to hurt me, or like these are kind of stereotypical fights men and women have. Like the man has done or said something insensitive, or the woman has perceived that what he's done or hasn't done is insensitive, and they're operating at different baselines of what sensitivity is, because the man is less intuitive or empathetic in general. But as you just said, like the flip side of that is, if you need protection, if you need someone to sacrifice themselves, all of a sudden that might come into play a little. Like men sacrifice themselves. They literally go to war and die to protect society.
And their lives historically are more dispensable.
Well, okay, but so that's a wonderful little, because often the socialization argument cuts against men. Like men are toxic because they're raised to be toxic. It's true, I think, that we raise men to be sacrificial. Like I think that's to be willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. I think there's a huge degree of truth in that. But men also have that in them to be sacrificial for the greater good. Like people who volunteer to go to war, like combat deaths are 97% male. It takes a really special person to voluntarily go into combat. Like that, like most people run from combat. They don't volunteer to walk into combat. But the people who do that are male. And
for the most part.
Well, 97% combat deaths.
Yeah.
97%.
Staggering.
It's staggering. And then there have been studies of what happens when you, like the military is relentlessly studying what happens when you put women into combat, because that's a variable. That's a very new thing. Like there have always been women who have fought. I'm not trying to but armies overwhelmingly were male. So what happens when you throw women into combat? And one of the things the US Army has found consistently is that men in the unit will sacrifice the goal of the mission to save a female soldier who's been captured. They won't do that for a male soldier.
And therefore
they will put
potentially sabotaging the entire mission.
But that's my point. They disregard the goal of the mission to save their female peer. Whereas if it's a man, there's an understanding sacrifice. There's a greater goal here. You got caught, you got injured. Like we'll do what we can for you, but there's still the mission. So holy shit, this is something really positive about male nature that
also a clear display of empathy towards the opposite sex.
Yeah. And or a willingness to be, like men have that in them too, that they want to protect. Like they really do want to feel like they're capable of not only providing for a woman that they love, but protecting her. Like that, they view that as a mission. That's a very healthy aspect of something that I think is very innate in men. And I wanted to say, oh God, what was I just thinking? Oh yeah, the preeminent example of toxic masculinity in the 21st century is mass shootings, which are overwhelmingly done by men. Every single time there's a mass shooting, the first responders, who are the cops who have to respond to, oh my God, there's a gunman on the loose shooting civilians. The cops are overwhelmingly male. So already there's a masculinity that is countering this toxic masculinity. But then look at the victims, and one of the things you'll consistently find is that men try to shield their loved ones, their girlfriends or their wives. They'll use their bodies as human shields to protect. Like the best example of this that comes to mind is Aurora, where some lunatic went into a movie theater and shot into so it was the Dark Knight screening, the premiere of the Dark Knight movie. And he shot into a crowd of moviegoers, and many of those were couples on dates. And men disproportionately died there because they put their bodies between their girlfriend, their loved one, and the shooter. I mean, that's a pretty incredible thing to do. And that impulse is in men too. That's one of the things that's really noble about masculinity. Often even in ignoble men, in men who are violent and not quick to empathize, they'll still willingly sacrifice themselves for someone they love, particularly a woman. And that doesn't get talked about at all. At all. It's just erased. And that really irks me.
It's irksome. It's also, part of me wonders sometimes if that doesn't get addressed or acknowledged is because it's taken for granted, in the sense that on the one hand, smash the patriarchy and toxic masculinity is innate. All men. To be masculine is to be toxic, apparently, for a lot of feminists. But what's also interesting is, I was reading this morning before we met up, a study was done, and women are actually more attracted to men who are able to exhibit displays of bravery and show that they're able to sacrifice themselves and go to war and be dominant and powerful in at least that arena.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting thing, and maybe a minefield to open up, but...
And it's so funny that persists even into a society that is, by historic standards, so safe. Like, the chances that you're ever going to need a man to protect you are very slim, but you want to date a man that's taller than you? Interesting. You want to date a man who's muscular? Interesting. Like, those are adornments. Those are entirely unnecessary, theoretically. But you have some innate attraction to tall, muscular men? Yes, I see. Seems like there's something basic at play there.
Well, I think it's being ignored because it's being taken for granted. Why do you think it's being ignored?
Well, I think that's probably true to an extent. I also just think it's society is so comfortable and safe now that we've forgotten. We've in a funny way, men have created a society that has made them obsolete, or made a lot of what they used to bring to the table obsolete.
When you say men have created a society,
I do mean that.
You
quite
do
explicitly.
mean that. Yeah, unpack that a little bit.
Well, even the far left will say we're living in a world created by men for men. They're conceding that the created part is still done by men.
And then, sorry, just like my immediate reaction earlier when we were talking about wars in general and the male...
that men perpetrate the war?
Well, so I think it's so interesting. Like, but if women ran the world, it would be a better, safer place.
Well, it's funny.
And there would be no World War I and
But
II.
There's evidence that that's true.
I mean...
That societies that
are
give
more
women...
are more democratic when they have women in their...
But are also just like less
structure.
likely to start a war of aggression, for example. When the women have more of a say in, like, that's a positive influence of women in politics. Like, they're less aggressive, less reactive to perceived threat, maybe.
And yet, had you read Machiavelli to me out loud and I didn't know who the author was, I would have been certain it was a woman.
But you're talking about like the subterfuge and the... Like
I don't know. I think if you judge history and society by the bad men who began wars, the horrific men, the tyrants, the dictators, and then make a blank statement to suggest that any female in their place would not have made similar decisions, I think is false. I don't think that's inherently true just because women are less violent or because women are less...
you can't generalize.
No, but I don't think it would be
from
necessarily the same, but I think you could find functional equivalents.
Well, part of the...
Evil is evil.
Yeah, but it's not even all evil. It's also like there's a survival calculus at play 1,000 years ago that's not at play today for most countries.
I'm thinking, when I think an obvious example is Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini.
Yeah, those are very recent. Well, serial killers too are predominantly male.
Yeah, with high levels of high IQs, no, for the most part.
I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that I've...
Edward Kemper.
Yeah, but I'm only pointing out that this is something...
Should we scratch that because it's
no. Camille Paglia said that. How did she phrase it? You have more male geniuses because you have more male Jack the Rippers.
Yes.
There's something about being an outlier.
On both extremes.
At all of the extremes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to get back, because I just want to sort of scratch at that a little bit more, because I've heard it time and time again, like, men started these wars historically, as far back as you can remember. If it were up to women, history would not have been the same. The society created by men is a society built on colonialism and war. Men, by extension, are inherently toxic because of all of those things that are apparently negative that form the foundations of our society. And yet, women and children and society itself has been able to progress and move forward because we spared the lives of millions and millions of women so that they could go on to have children and continue the race. while millions and millions and millions of men died.
Yeah, I would have to.
If women ran the world, would there be no wars? I mean, no. There's a culture war going on that's mostly fueled by women. And
no, but I mean, war is a physical aggression, and the culture war is reputational for the most part. We're not burning people at the stake anymore.
No, but we are slowly teetering on the edge of some kind of destruction. Whether it manifests into something physical is TBD.
I hesitate. I almost said before that men have a close to monopoly on evil, and I don't want to say that because I don't think I believe that. But I think male evil is more likely to manifest itself in things like murder.
But do you think it's unfair to say that Machiavelli could have easily been a woman?
No, because I think that's the women who are evil. I don't think I know it. I would be on much shakier ground talking about evil women, but it tends to like for example, when women murder, like poison is disproportionately the weapon.
It's highly
of choice.
Calculated murder.
No, but poison as a murder weapon is like the perfect.
But also the timing of when they're poisoned. There's a thought out plan.
No, but I said earlier that women, when they're aggressive, are indirect, and they go after reputations, and they go behind. They use subterfuge. Like poison is like that. It's like you don't have to know who murdered the person, and it's not direct. Whereas if you beat someone to death or strangle them with your bare hands, that's about as direct as it gets. You're looking the person in the eye as you kill them, or you go up and shoot them, or whatever. Those are more male-dominated means of murder. But let's pit like there are a lot, like the question of if women ran the world, would there be fewer wars or less violence? It's there's a lot of speculation and.
Well, women are tend to be more collaborative.
I've conceded
more able to get at a compromise.
I conceded that. Well, in Better Angels of Our Nature, which is Pinker's book on the decline of violence, there's a whole section on how the West was tamed. And he suggests that it was because all of a sudden the frontier was peopled by predominantly men who went out there, and like the women were there, but there were women who were basically like they were prostitutes. The money was there, so they were going to. But eventually, it was like the quote unquote respectable women who also went out west. And okay, yeah, I'll marry you, but you got to settle down from that outlaw lifestyle. And that's what I mean. Feminists resent that women the idea that women play a civilizing influence on men. But they do. Married men are not violent, or not violent anywhere near to the same degree that single men are violent.
And studies have been shown too that like the propensity for violence actually and aggression declines dramatically when men actually have children and are able to hold their children.
So that's too, yeah. So violence is not. I said it's an overwhelmingly male pursuit. It's also an overwhelmingly young male pursuit. I think between 16 and 35 is where men are they're most violent, and after 35 it drops off a cliff. There aren't that many violent 50-year-old men. Or 55 or 60-year-old men.
Let's explore the consequences though more in depth on so the consequences on male relationships, for example.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier.
Given everything we said and we know about violence in men,
and the stat, like the constant,
the pecking order, the status
that you're constantly as a man entering into various hierarchies where how well you're treated by other people is dependent on how well you do in that hierarchy. And I gave the example, I work out at a gym where I also play basketball. And when there's a pecking order among the basketball players, which is like the best basketball players are the people, the guys everyone wants on their team, and the worst basketball players are the guys no one wants on their team. But a lot of those same people after ball is done will go upstairs and work out. And all of a sudden there's a different pecking order. It's like, oh my God, that guy's benching 3 plates. Like that's incredibly impressive. But that guy's not any good at basketball. But it doesn't matter that he's not good at basketball because we've gone up a floor, we've switched environments, and now like the pecking order is determined by strength or some other variable. Like there are guys who come to play basketball who are lawyers. So professionally, they're very successful. But their professional success means nothing to anyone on the basketball court. Like, oh, like you make a lot of money? I don't give a shit. You can't hit a jump shot. Like, I don't want you on my team. And that's very much a male experience of life, is like you could have a high degree of status in one domain or in one field and have no status or negative status in another field. And that's I would say that's a difficult and stressful thing about being a man. Like you're constantly judged on that.
Right, which I think is interesting because that argument is taken up and sort of manipulated in other narratives about male behavior and masculinity in general, that because we're not socializing men properly and not conditioning them to be more emotionally available, they're still prioritizing or having as goals, personal goals, to be stronger and more physically macho, and they are still trying to hold themselves up to these impossible male stereotypes, action figure-like stereotypes. And I don't know, what do you have to say about that? What do you think about it?
I can't even imagine being a man and not having, like, these are so ingrained in me and so innate in me, I think. Like, from the youngest age, I cared about all of these things. And I cared about them independently of, like, I found weightlifting before anyone told me I should, like, be interested in weightlifting. I didn't have peers that were into that at the time.
Which is not true for all men, certainly.
It's certainly not true for all men, but I'm just saying.
But you have, so, like, for example, like, some of my closest male friends, I would say, are more feminine in their nature, more docile.
I mean, I have that too, of course.
Yeah, I think everyone does, to some degree. But I think it's interesting to note that we encounter maybe more men our age and millennials who maybe exhibit more female traits in terms of their personality or their behavior. And certainly their emotional expression, like how they're able to express themselves emotionally. And that has now kind of become this weird, like, in our millennial culture, like a gold standard of, like, how we should be educating and raising men to become. I mean, there are TV series I can think of right now off the top of my head, but, like, you know, that bro stereotype, the jock, is now painted in a lot of shows targeted towards, you know, I guess, Gen Z. They act like little bullies. Like, they seem like little shits. They're like the worst of what I think people perceive incel culture to be. And they have the worst dialogue, and they're mean.
And to give the devil his due, there are men who are exactly that cliche.
And have always been.
And they can walk through the world stepping on other people, and it doesn't even seem to faze them. They feel no guilt for it.
But now it's obviously targeting...
No, but I was going to say...
men in sport on TV.
Sure. But I would say, like, having lived in that world with, like, very macho men, like, it's amazing the degree to which those, like, a lot, I concede that there are those male bullies who are just sort of unredeemable. But there are also, like, men who are incredibly strong and macho who are really excited about helping you bench a plate for the first time. And it will give you, like, they'll spend half an hour.
Encouraging and supportive.
And support. And they're benching 300 pounds. But if you need help benching a plate, they're standing over you. Yeah, come on, man. You got this. You can do it. They're encouraging you. They're giving you support.
But
like my whole life in that, I saw those callous macho men stepping over other people. But I also saw, particularly in coaches who are often ex-athletes themselves, I saw that masculinity that was like, I want you to succeed, and I'll feel good if you succeed. I saw that too.
But what's interesting is now I think all of it is being painted in this negative light in popular culture now, in television series, and we're fictionalizing our woke culture to reinforce it, and make it seem like it's the objective truth.
Oh, I think there's a theory that all competition breeds this indifference in men. Like, there's like we're suspicious of competition, and this is not like this is a minority of people who happen to have some cultural power, so that they can say they might write the show, for example, but this is still not most people. Like, there's there's a real pushback in America against the idea of giving kids participation trophies. Like, people still want that hierarchy and that acknowledgement of, like, you were the best and you did really well. Yeah.
But we're favoring inclusivity, equality of outcome.
Certainly some people are, and those people have cultural influence, but I still don't think that's most people. But I was only trying to push back, like, among the men who are in, you know, hyper macho and are competing in these ultra competitive fields, like, there's a lot of nobility and a lot of self-sacrifice and a lot of a kind of spirit of camaraderie and wishing the best for other people. Like, sportsmanship still matters. It really does. Like people, the Michael Jordan documentary with Isaiah Thomas walks off the court without shaking hands, that bothers people decades later. It's like, you couldn't, like, you fought a war for 7 games in a playoff series and you can't shake the guy's hand after the game. Yeah. We don't like you for that. Like there's a proper way to go into combat. Or
Pippen refusing to play.
Yeah, there you go. There. Yes. You let your team down.
And his reputation.
And you bled. Yeah, but
he let his team down while everyone else was going to war.
And there's another sports war analogy, but like the drilling for sports and the drilling for the military. I mean, the military is more grueling, I'm sure, but they're comparable in the sense that it's going to be a lot of self-sacrifice, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of pushing yourself to your limits and then beyond your limits.
So what I'm trying to get at is, I think, and I think this has been true forever. There are men who don't fit in the realm of sports, who don't feel comfortable there, who are not drawn to it for various reasons. In high schools, they're misfits or nerds. They're, I think, unfortunately labeled by their male peers as like not tough or
well, they might
weak.
Also not be tough.
They might not be tough. They typically, I guess, find their place in life later on, maybe in college or after college when they're out earning. Most people,
or they're artsy,
Yeah,
nothing wrong with that.
No, but I think it's interesting to note that my closest male friends fall more into that category.
The non-macho,
creative, non-macho.
Well, there are upsides to those things too.
No, of course, and I think what a lot of groups who claim to care about men's issues and men's health and certainly men's mental issues gravitate toward the narrative that we have been conditioning men to behave like macho brutes for too long. It's high time we pivot whatever it is that we're doing that makes men this way and start making empathetic, caring, compassionate, vulnerable, deep feeling men. As though all of those traits, first of all, are not already possible or inherent within the realm of...
That's exactly what I was trying to point out by saying that I've had incredible support and encouragement from macho men in sports and
who are exhibiting empathy, who are making themselves available.
Coaches or team captains or people who are like sincerely want you to succeed and devote energy to that. They do display empathy and concern and kindness, and they don't get credit for that anymore, and they should.
And this goes back to, I think, how perhaps aggression and male behavior impacts male-female relationships a little bit. But so much of sexual attraction, physiological attraction and desire, and Esther Perel, says this way better than I ever could, and it's in her book Mating in Captivity. But there's this double message like that men are getting when they're in relationships, which is, I want you to be emotionally available, I want you to be sensitive, I want you to intuit my feelings before I even have to express them, and I want you to be sexually dominant, powerful, and an absolute Casanova in the bedroom. I have yet to meet a man like that, as and there is no female equivalent. Getting back to, we no longer know what to do with men. Well, we no longer really know what to say about them because we're actually removing all of the evidence, or we're ignoring it in favor of a narrative that suits a more feminine perspective. Well, I don't know. Like, how does that make you feel to hear that like you needed to learn how to be more emotionally available and like your vulnerability is what counts, not your physical strength. Like all those. What was the Gillette ad? There's like so many things right now that I can think of that reinforce this message that we need to recondition male behavior. And I don't think that's at all the healthy approach.
Well, one of the worst things about that ad, and maybe that approach in general, is that it presupposes that the average man is closer to the most toxic men than they are to, like, I don't know, kind, caring, self-sacrificing men, which I think have almost always been the norm.
But that's a paralyzing narrative to absorb right now in culture if you're a young man.
Well, there's also so much pushback. People are so sick of this. It's a small group of very influential people who have money and power within like the advertising world or within academia or within television. They're scriptwriters, but you put that out into the wider society and people just vomit at it.
There is pushback, but like if you're currently attending a four-year liberal arts college and you have certain views on feminism and the patriarchy, and let's say you're watching that Gillette ad, it would make perfect sense to you, that Gillette ad. because it's perfectly in line with your ideological views on gender.
Yes.
And yet it's so far from the reality of everything we're saying and the evidence that's overwhelming regarding how men and women date, how they choose partners, and how male behavior.
Well, I'm laughing because I was just going to say their ideological view of gender is at odds with what their actions dictate their view of gender might be.
Precisely.
So, for example...
But I'm saying that that's setting men up.
No, but let me finish that sentence because I'll get myself in trouble. Those people who go to 4-year liberal arts colleges and have an ideological view of gender that is at odds with, let's say, reality, I think that view of gender is also at odds with how they really behave in the real world. Because I went to a 4-year liberal arts college, and I can tell you the frat boys who are supposedly like, you know, the most toxic of the men, they had a great time. All the parties and every weekend were at the frat houses. There's a very funny disconnect between what people profess to believe and what they profess they want in men versus what they actually choose in men. And I'm inclined to trust people's actions more than their words.
That's well said. And I think what I'm trying to get at is how paralyzing I think that message is to receive if you're a young man right now trying to navigate dating and career and your own masculinity.
Paralyzing and very confusing.
Astonishingly confusing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sets you up to fail.
I see. Like, we haven't spoken about this, and it's a fact worth stating. The fact that men are so much stronger and so much more likely to be violent affects how women walk through the world. I've never met a woman who hasn't told me at some point on a regular basis in her week, if she's out at night, she's afraid. Mm-hmm. She has to think about her personal safety. I'm not saying I never think about that, but it's not a concern. I mean, I live in a very safe city in a safe neighborhood, but my reality as a 6 foot, 200 pound male is very different than 5 foot, 310 pound female's reality might be. And that's worth talking about. And I think it's worth talking about even if we say men are the majority of victims of violence. That reality that men are the majority of the victims of violence doesn't actually impact my perception of my likelihood of being murdered or beaten up walking down the street at night. Like, much more likely, the women's diminutive physical stature makes them much more fearful. And that's a reality of and
that's innate. It's an innate fear, you would say.
I would say that's an innate, I would say that it's an ineradicable reality. Like, you are smaller and weaker, and you walk through the world knowing that you're smaller, and because you're smaller and weaker, you're vulnerable in a way that larger and stronger men might not be vulnerable.
I've only felt unsafe in foreign places in which I did not know my surroundings as well as I do here. And I have to say that it's very rare that I feel physically unsafe.
I'm saying I've heard that frequently.
No, as have I.
Yeah.
But I've also heard it associated with the underlying assumption that at any given time a man is, wanting to rape them.
Right. And then
there's a magnified reason for that fear.
But that's why I specifically included male-female relations in the note, because that's another, like, if it's one thing to walk to your car at night after work, it's another thing to meet a stranger at a bar or on a Tinder date. Like, those are all
possibly dangerous scenarios.
Possibly dangerous, and I think a lot of, like, that's a very shocking fact of modern dating that just gets totally glossed over. That at exactly the moment where we're hyper focused on male aggression towards women and the dangers and threats men pose to women, we've also normalized dating with strangers to an incredible degree. Like, really, like, your female ancestors would be shocked to hear that, like, it's not uncommon for women to meet total strangers alone in bars in the city. And I'm not like, I think it's a good thing that we can do that. Like, obviously society is safer, or at least, or it must be, that this goes on, but it's worth noting that it's going on at a period where we're also really concerned about the male perpetrator, the male rapist, the male sexual assault.
This is how confused and dysfunctional we've become, because sexual promiscuity is also now apparently a pillar of the liberated modern woman. It's also the very thing that puts their safety and health at risk at any given time in their single life. And it sounds conservative, out of date, and out of touch to suggest anything otherwise.
I I didn't even mean this like.
No, but like they like young women like are also like they're absorbing all of these conflicting messages and having to navigate their dating life accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
How do you be a responsible feminist in that way? If on the one hand you're constantly worrying about your physical safety and you're also encountering strangers because you're exercising your sexual liberty.
I was partially suggesting that,
but it's a minefield.
Yeah.
And it points to another highly confusing message that I think women are forced to wrap their heads around, even though it's impossible.
If it's the case that men are as dangerous as we're told they are, modern dating doesn't make much sense.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Modern dating for women makes no sense, let alone for men.
And there are 18-year-old girls meeting up with 25 and 30-year-old men that are total strangers to them, but they've talked on a dating app. Like,
yeah, it's fucked.
It's a little fucked.
And there are no rules.
Right. And then there's a species of person, male and female, who says that this is freedom and it's a good thing.
That's what I'm saying. This is the sexually liberated woman.
Well, there are men who think this too. And like, I won't like there because the opposite of this was, supervised dates where you weren't trusted to have a conversation alone with a man, or the man wasn't trusted to have a conversation alone with you,
which is condescending to an extent, but also
which is paternalistic and condescending, and I'm
also
sure,
with the view of your safety first and foremost in mind.
Oh, maybe your safety, but also not ruining your reputation or getting pregnant or being taken advantage of by the man.
I think all of those are related to safety in one form or another.
Sure.
Your well-being,
but as defined by a third party.
As defined by, maybe an
18-year-old,
maybe a male third party, and therefore,
or maybe a female third party. Yeah, and the easiest criticism will be what we're asking for is a return to the paternalistic chaperone dating, and I don't think that is entailed by the criticism we're making. I'm only saying, not only is there something dysfunctional about the way we're dating, but it's contradictory to what we're claiming about the threat men represent to women.
So when you say, okay, so just want to clarify too, when we say the fact of these differences, the differences between men and women,
this massive strength differences alone. So, because it's a power difference.
So the differences in physical power between men and women, how does that impact society? What are the consequences?
Well, at a minimum, it informs who's going to be doing the physical labor in your society. You've brought this up in another episode, but it's not surprising when you look at those strength differences that construction work and carpentry and fishing and agriculture are dominated by men. They're better suited to it physiologically. As controversial as that might be to say, they are better suited to it physiologically.
When did that become controversial to say?
Oh, sometime in the last 30 years. In our lifetimes.
Not before our lifetimes.
I don't think so. I mean, in segments of society, or in segments of academia, probably. But yeah, not in wider society. I still don't think in a wider society it's controversial to say men are better physically suited to construction work than women.
Sometimes I like to think that you're right about that the majority is.
I still think I am right about that.
My social media feed would dictate otherwise.
Right, but that's a biased sample size of people who had terrible educations.
Another minefield thing to say.
That's the thing I find least controversial to say. Or the least most true. The most objectively true thing I think I know is that people educated in the last 20 years in the humanities have been terribly shortchanged. So it informs, that's a minimum. It's going to inform who's doing what jobs. But that's a problem too, because if your goal is to equalize employment outcomes between men and women, it's already a non-starter. It's already a non-starter.
Well, and certainly in those labor forces.
Well, those are big. They're
huge, yeah.
Big sectors of the economy. Not only,
but that's not where women are seeking equality for the most part. There's the.
But then it might also be worth asking, more minefield. If men are better physiologically suited to some jobs, are women better physiologically suited to some jobs? Is it an accident that nursing is dominated by women? Is it an accident that primary school education is dominated by women? Maybe not. Maybe not. Now that's a minefield topic.
I'm not sure. Yeah, and I still
Well, here's
I always
one.
just go silent when these discussions erupt because I really
Here's a great.
I don't know why that's also controversial.
Oh, because people don't want to believe
can't women
that
dominate fields?
Because I can tell you the best answer as to why that's controversial is because the idea that women are more nurturing than men was an excuse to keep women out of all professions,
and that also typically nurses do get paid not as well. They're not high-paying fields that women enter into.
Nursing is like a pretty well compensated field.
Yeah.
Probably not to how hard it is.
Not to how hard and how many hours and what you're actually having to deal with.
Yeah.
Which we're seeing now also in, elder care workers in Quebec and the crisis around that. But I mean, I think that's more of a societal structure issue than it is anything to do with male and female pay gap.
I've got a good, I would love to probe the people who think gender is a social construct and who have, who work in, maybe they're professors. Here's a great question to ask them. Would you hire a male babysitter for your children? I really want to. I would love to see some data on that because I think.
You think overwhelmingly it'd be no?
I think people instinctually trust. If you're going to trust a teenager, especially with supervising your children,
you're not hiring a teenage boy to babysit your kids.
It would be unwise,
foolish.
Yeah. There's actually a great Friends episode, which is now so politically incorrect that whole show has been. But there's a great Friends episode where Ross and Rachel quarrel over hiring a male babysitter.
In the later seasons?
Yeah, one of the later seasons.
Friends is actually a great case study in just in general, whatever you think about the show. It's a great case study in
just watching the development of sitcoms over the last few decades.
Is a really great way to
what they could take for granted from their audience.
Yeah. And also underlying values, which used to be to me so clear and now are so ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing all of this. Knowing what we know about male violence and what its channels and outlets, good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we're ignoring, well, in a nutshell, too, what has gone underreported or what is being completely ignored about this right now in our society.
I think if you treat men and women as if they're interchangeable or that they're infinitely malleable, that you can socialize them to be like each other or to be different than they are, you risk not socializing men in a way that channels those aggressive, violent impulses into something positive and social. And eventually those are going to come back to bite you. Men are, we said men are the majority of criminals and they perpetrate the majority of violence. They're also the revolutionaries. They're also the ones who will burn down society and, force it to restart.
Don't have to look too far for examples of that.
No, not at all. Absolutely not at all. Actually, before you came here, I was watching a YouTube video. We've just gone through a month of rioting in America. And at one point in Seattle, and I watched this happen like 10 minutes after it happened in real time, protesters broke into cop cars and started taking assault rifles from cop cars. They were arming themselves with the cops' own weapons in Seattle. And then just 10 minutes before you came here, I was watching a video of a Marine who had been hired out by a news crew in Seattle to protect them as they covered the protests. And this Marine witnessed these protesters stealing the guns. And he came up behind them, pistol drawn, and made them drop their guns. And then he got back the assault weapons and returned them to the police. And that was such a little perfect example in microcosm of there's male violence and propensity for, let's say, mischief used for chaos in the form of the protesters. And there's the Marine who has like literally decades of weapons training, disarming guys with an assault rifle while he only has a pistol.
Because he's talking them down.
He's pointing the gun at them and saying, you're going to drop that weapon. And you see, like, instantly you see them. I mean, they almost piss their pants. They drop the gun. He picks it up and then he disassembles it because he spent a lifetime playing. Like this is training he's had for decades. Disassembles the guns, puts them in his backpack, and then it's not on camera, but he returns them to the police. It's like, you couldn't ask for a better example of like the competent male who can be violent but has restrained it and he can channel it for the good of society, versus the incompetent male who is capable of being violent but doesn't know how to use it or will use it in a way that's very destructive. The first guy who breaks in and steals the weapons, he fires 4 rounds into the cop car. That's how he tests if the weapon's loaded. So you fire 4 rounds at a car in a crowd of people. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just like massively irresponsible. And he's disarmed by a guy with a pistol who has, decades of training as a Marine.
And to those people who would deny, or to those who would claim that ultimately aggression and violence in men is a result of socialization.
I mean, good luck to you. I think one of the things that's difficult about defending the nurture position is that so much of what society did to channel men's violent impulses was done instinctually. It was more like a wisdom that was through tradition and culture and kind of, received wisdom and received practices rather than articulated knowledge. Like there are tribes, I'm going to say primitive tribes, that have had little contact with the outside world, where one of the first rituals they have is for boys going through manhood, and they have to earn their place in the tribe. They have to successfully hunt a lion, or they have to withstand some. One of my favorite examples is, I think it's some tribe in South America. They put bullet ants into a glove that the children have to then put on, the boy children. And they put the glove with bullet ant. And a bullet ant, apparently, the bite of a bullet ant is comparable to being shot on the pain index. So you put this on, this glove of bullet ants, and they're going to bite you. And you have to withstand that pain. Some of them die from this. They go into shock and die. But that's your entrance into manhood. But that's also you're showing you're sacrificing for the tribe. That's you putting your masculine energy, let's say, in service of society. I mean, Israel has mandatory military service. We've had conscription in the West before.
I'm beginning to think the United States might need that. I think our culture might need that.
Israel's mandatory military service is gender neutral, I believe. Yeah, it is. The women also have to participate. The most encouraging thing I can say about men's propensity to violence or aggression is that, properly channeled, it's a force for good in the world. Improperly channeled, it's the most destructive thing we know of. But properly channeled, it's...
I'd like to hang my hat on the good.
Yeah, well, we have historically. That's what I find so...
Do you still feel, for the most part, we are?
Oh, I don't think we could... When we stop doing that entirely, things will really go to shit. We're in the attitudes towards the police. I'm seeing some of that. That's a whole other can of worms. But that's a good police officer is an example of, and it's not that there aren't obviously very good female police officers, but police officers in general are majority male. They do a very difficult job and a very necessary job. And that's a great example of male sacrifice and male violence channeled towards the good of society.
It's a very controversial thing to say right now.
It shouldn't be. It really shouldn't be.
I know.
Because I just thought I would say that. But the people who think that's controversial, if they were ever put in a scenario where their life was in jeopardy, the first impulse they'd have would be to call the police.
But they would,
and it happens all. So here,
but they would say that's a society construct. All the arguments,
but it's ludicrous. The Minneapolis City Council that voted to disband their police department, they now have private police protection. Did you know that?
I did not. That's where that money went?
They're paid for by taxpayers, but protecting them. It's so astonishing. And that's exactly, that's what will happen. Many, many wise people have said that if you abolish the police force, what you're really doing is giving the rich a social advantage they never should have had or never should have, which is...
When they already have one.
But they all have private security. Mm-hmm. There's not a single billionaire in America who doesn't have private security. And all the celebrities have bodyguards. So of course, that's not something that should be privatized. Anyway, that's a whole other can of worms. But everything we talk about is a can of worms. But it's sad that we've gotten to that point. Like the TV show Cops is off the air now. Lego is banning their cops. They used to have cop-themed
Paw
Legos.
Patrol is being banned.
Yeah, there you go.
Or they wanted to ban it. I didn't actually follow up on that.
No, but it's just the impulse. It's ludicrous. It's really ludicrous.
So what, in your view, needs to happen? What would need to improve for men?
I think just the acceptance that this is a part of masculinity and that it's something that society has to effectively channel and harness for it not to become destructive. That has to come back. And that boys, I don't know. I don't think if you don't have a father, I don't think you're doomed to be violent. I'm not making that case. But boy, does having a father help you channel those aggressions and those sort of impulses, innate impulses you have. They really do help you constructively harness that in a way that'll not get you ostracized from society.